The issue we're going to be talking about next is ways in which the military and commercial sectors can collaborate, come together, and what some of their interests and incentives are, particularly around transforming flight. And so, actually in the Q&A, somebody mentioned the enormous aviation fuel proportion that of the DoD energy budget that is dedicated to aviation fuel compared to electricity or compared to other things. And so I'm really excited to welcome Iris Ferguson, who's a senior advisor for energy and climate issues in the U.S. Air Force. Full disclosure, Iris and I served together in the Air Force during the Obama administration, working on energy and climate issues together. So I know firsthand her brilliance and her her dedication to a lot of this work and a lot of these issues. She also served formerly as an official at the Department of Commerce and as a foreign policy aide to then Senator Joe Biden. So she's got some deep insight. Maybe we'll get to some questions about that as well later. I'd also like to welcome Kim Carnahan who's the Director of Disruption Technologies at ENGIE Impact, one of the cooler job titles I've ever heard. And Kim also has a distinguished career in international engagement around climate issues. She served as the primary negotiator at the State Department for climate change prior to working on what she does now, which is really focused on alternative fuels, focused on a lot of the really emerging technologies that could make air travel more sustainable, could make air travel more capable and flexible. All of things that I think there's a shared interest between the commercial aviation sector and the military. So Iris, I want to start with you and just dig into, tell us a little bit about the Air Force's air travel portfolio, why it's so important that we start thinking about and investing in a broad range of technologies to help transform flight, to help encourage sustainable fuels and flexible fuels and everything that goes along with that.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Mike. This is a really important conversation and something that has been front of the mind for the Air Force for actually quite a while, because we, as noted, we use an immense amount of fuel. We actually use 60% of the total DoD use, and it's basically more than all services combined. And focusing on the fuel aspect is just one part of the broader sustainable aviation discussion, but we've been looking at this for quite a while. Even back in the early 2000s, when oil and gas were really expensive, we looked at how to create new fuel types for our aircraft, or rather to have our aircraft be able to certified to fly on them. And about 10 years ago, we certified our aircraft to fly on 50-50 blend fuel, 50% Jet A, 50% other. And at the time, we focused on what we thought would come to market quickest, because these are some of the key variables when we talked about how the military adopts technology and how we're able to actually move forward on things like fuel adoption. There's some key parts of it, and one of it is cost. And this is a really big factor. It's unlikely that the Air Force will actually ever produce its own fuel, we actually don't even purchase it ourselves. The DLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, purchase it for us. And if it's not cost competitive with petroleum, it becomes a real challenge for us to purchase it. And the second piece is mission. The commercial aviation industry has a relatively different mission set than the Air Force. Unsurprisingly, we have refueling needs, we have cargo transportation needs, we have combat mission needs, and so the drivers for defense are slightly different than the commercial industry. And then lastly, just fuel use at large. A lot of people think that the Air Force is because of our number of aircraft that we use as much as the commercial aviation industry, and that's not exactly true. We have about 5,000 aircraft in our inventory, which is huge, admittedly. A lot of the major airliners only have about 1,000, but we only use about those aircraft about 10% of the time. So, if you're looking at the numbers, even if you're comparing us to larger airlines, we're using $2 billion in fuel, 2 billion gallons in fuel annually, and they're consuming more like 4 billion. gallons of fuel. And that's not to say that we're not interested in diversification of fuel. We are very much interested in diversification, and really excited to talk about these things later on, Mike, about combat credibility or capability, and just quite frankly, common sense measures like reducing our energy footprint and reducing the costs that we're spending on fuel. And we know that the industry is moving in this direction. I'm really excited to hear from Kim about their work on sustainable aviation fuels. We want to make sure that we have a seat at the table as this is uncharted, and as companies are in commercial aviation industry is moving down the path of sustainable aviation fuels. We're working closely with our interagency partners like the Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and some of their fuels work as well. So looking forward to this conversation. Thanks.
All right, so let me follow up just on one point, which is, you're looking at sustainable fuels and more and flexibly fueled aircraft, but also touch on a little bit about aircraft efficiencies and enabling aircraft to, be longer duration, to fly farther on less fuel, and to increase efficiencies on the aircraft.
The efficiency
themselves.
game is actually, arguably you could say even more important and lower hanging fruit for the Department of the Air Force. It's quite frankly, it just makes common sense. It increases our combat capability. When we look at efficiencies, we can increase the range and endurance. This is especially important when we're looking at long range distances like flights, potential conflicts over the Pacific region. And we're working on efficiencies in three primary ways. Just really briefly, stole this adage, but people, platform, processes. From a people perspective, just incentivizing fuel conservation efforts like start engine techniques and precision fuel planning. From a platform perspective, we're looking at aerodynamic upgrades. We've recently added vertical windshield wipers to our KC-135s, which are the aerial refueling takers. On our C-17s, we've added winglets to the back of the aircraft where the cargo ramp goes down. And we've been able to do this and decrease drag by about 1%. And 1% drag reduction doesn't sound like a lot, but actually when you do the numbers, it's saving us about $7 million and $10 million respectively in fuel use per year. And then the last part about the efficiencies is on processes. And this is actually where we see the biggest gains in our fuel conservation work. And that's somewhat to do with the challenges that the Department of Defense has and the Air Force has had with planning, mission, and execution. And in that we're recently adopting new technologies towards helping us become more efficient in how we execute our missions. We've got a number of initiatives ranging from planning, tanker refueling planning issues, to cargo planning. And some of one example is some software that we're implementing to try to help manage all of the entire fleet. We have, for our mobility aircraft, we have 200 plus C-17s, 50 C-5s, and about 400 C-130s. That's a lot of aircraft to manage on any day-to-day basis based off of Air Force demand and combatant command requirements. So we're using software that's helping us kind of map out how we can better allocate fuel, better allocate these resources. And we're actually, just by the software, we're expected to save 9 million in gallons of fuel per year. So there's quite a few efficiency efforts that are going on, and much more that we can do.
Awesome. Now, Kim, again, you have a very fascinating sounding job. I would just like to understand a little bit about ENGIE Impact and how are you bringing together different organizations? How are you thinking about companies? Because one of the things that we're really focused on is how do we start articulating with one voice what industry capabilities are, or how do we provide insight at what the state of technology is? Because I think it's a really difficult thing, particularly as Melanie mentioned before, with how emerging a lot of energy and climate technologies are. And that's something that it seems like you're really there to keep an eye on and think about the potential of.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question to something that I've been dealing with on a daily basis, coming from a primarily European-based company. And now, working specifically in the US, I find that especially in the field that I'm working in, which is advanced fuels, that we do have some differences, and the US is a little bit behind, and some of the US developers are a little bit behind in where they are in developing these projects. And so I may feel very comfortable kind of putting forward a lot of project examples for hydrogen projects, for example. But then I talk to some of my peers in this field, and they don't yet have those example projects to talk up to members of Congress about, for example. So we're definitely in that space of it depends on who you talk to, how comfortable they are talking about different technologies and how comfortable they are talking in particular about the costs of different technologies. So I'll back up for just a second though, because a lot of people haven't heard of ENGIE. And so if you haven't heard of ENGIE, we're actually the largest independent power producer in the world. I often say it's the largest company that most Americans have never heard of. We kind of started as a natural gas company and have specialized in that for, I don't know, 140 years or something, but are very quickly becoming known primarily as a renewables developer, and particularly in the United States. So we kind of parlayed that history as well as our kind of recent past of renewables development into becoming a pioneer in the electrolytic hydrogen market. We started one of the very first green hydrogen only business units in the world. And we kind of use our past experience to become integrators of the entire kind of project value chain, from renewable energy development all the way through transport and usage. So I sit within, as you mentioned, Michael, the ENGIE Impact Team, which is ENGIE Group's internal and external advisory or consultancy firm. So I both help ENGIE Group figure out how to kind of maximize its move towards decarbonization, as well as I help customers do the same thing. And ENGIE recently announced a net zero by 2045 deadline. We have one of the world's, if not the world's first science-based target validated for an energy company. So we're definitely kind of pushing hard and fast towards decarbonization of ourselves as well as our customers. And yeah, I lead the disruption technologies team, which covers all alternative fuels, both kind of biofuels, even though ENGIE doesn't produce biofuels, as well as green hydrogen and alternative aviation and maritime fuels. And we have a number of really exciting things in both of those spaces. Like we do everything from early stage market studies to a lot of costing studies, getting back to the first point. So a lot of companies have no idea what it would cost to engage with or include or integrate green hydrogen into their business plan. So we're able to come in and help them figure out how to do that. We can do the same for governments. We've done government studies, both in terms of when they're trying to prepare to see whether or not it makes sense to export green hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen, for example, as well as whether or not it makes sense to integrate green hydrogen use into their own energy use plans. So we both work with the governments and the non-governments alike. And within my job right now, I say about 50% of my time I spend actually originating green hydrogen, electrolytic hydrogen projects in the United States. And that's a very nascent field. So it's one in which I'm constantly kind of explaining to people what we're doing and how and why and what the costs are and what the risks are. Synthetic fuels, especially for aviation, is another really interesting space for ENGIE and for the world. And I know we're here to talk about aviation. ENGIE has actually been partnering with a number of companies and organizations to try to understand the future market for and the value chain for developing synthetic aviation fuels. And just that, to that end, just earlier this year in February, we announced the development of a new consortium to produce synthetic jet fuel from renewable electricity, water, and biogenic CO2. This project is based in Normandy, France, with the goal of achieving carbon neutrality over the life cycle of the fuels. So they're intending to be net zero fuels. And we joined forces actually with a number of companies to do this. So we're working with German electrolysis company Sunfire, as well as kind of leading partners in the aviation sector, ADP Group, Airbus, Air France, KLM, and Safran. So just as we have 30 green hydrogen projects in development in 10 countries globally, we would love to expand our work in synthetic fuels space, in particular for aviation, but also maritime here in the US as well as elsewhere. So just because we're a French company, doesn't mean we don't want to work everywhere. We do. And in fact, I've been kind of in initial talks with some folks at the Department of Defense and the Air Force about how we might help, integrate synthetic fuels into the future of the Air Force, for example. And I think that's a really exciting space. And I heard Sharon Burke say earlier that, the US government and the military is an amazing innovation pool, and we feel that as well. And even though we've been working with other governments on their kind of innovation processes in this space, of course, I'm biased because I used to work for the US government for quite a long time, but I think that if we were able to do a partnership with some US-based companies as well as the US military, that the kind of technology that we're working on would move so much farther and faster, actually. So I think it's an amazing space to explore.
Awesome, Kim. Yeah, that's a really great background and understanding of both your work and also just some of the larger dynamics in the market. And so that's what I really, would love to dive in a little deeper on for Iris and Kim. I mean, do you, in your conversations with the Air Force and DoD, are you seeing that kind of confluence of drivers and factors from the aviation industry more largely, and particularly to what the military is looking for? Iris, you touched on sort of capability improvements, the need for more flexibility around supply chain issues and things like that. Is that something that you think is, are those the correct drivers, and are those going to lead us sort of where we're describing, where there's a great partnership and where we're really thinking about transforming flight, really fundamentally disrupting and changing the nature of air travel, air mobility, air combat? And I guess that's a question, Iris, if you want to try that question first, and then I would love to hear Kim's take on that as well.
Well, yeah, and I think that there, it's back to what Sharon was saying about how do you, what are the drivers for change? And for for the military, it's slightly different. It's about increasing the mission capability, and that certainly it's you want to have safe aircraft flight, you want to have safe means of transport for the commercial sector, but we just have slightly different drivers. And I think as we're talking about partnerships, it's really important to figure out where those synergies are. And certainly, where there's technology development that we could use, it's in the short term, it's in the software development. I kind of talked about that low-hanging fruit, and that's figuring out better about our mission and execution planning. That's a lot of the commercial aviation sector has done a lot of work in that because it's good for their bottom line. It's something that we're still working on. As we look to the future about how we're designing our aircraft, both to be more efficient and use less fuel, but also to be able to fly longer. We're looking at potentially new aircraft design types, new aerodynamic body types, so the next generation of long-haul aircraft. Those are areas where we really think that the commercial aviation sector, along with us, can really move the needle forward. And I think the key is kind of finding those the overlap and in interest, but also talking about cost sharing too. I think it's going to be really challenging for the U.S. military to potentially go out alone on it. Something I talked about that with the fuels, that it's unlikely for us to set the market for fuels just because of the cost piece of it, because of our mission, and because of just our overall fuel use at large. And I think that you could almost say the same for some of the other big bets in technology that we're really looking at the private sector to go along with us on this ride.
And yeah, I'll jump in. I was about to say, drivers of more sustainable kind of aviation. I see kind of two main drivers, and then one kind of probably less important driver. And the first would be policy. So not so much that the cost sharing piece, but that we need to see more kind of government effort to supporting the development of synthetic fuels as well as advanced biofuels for aviation. And I really am focused mostly on the fuels piece. Of course, the kind of aircraft design piece is important as well. Everything I've seen from the aircraft manufacturers is that they're already really focused on increasing efficiency, exactly for the same reason Iris mentioned. It's important for the bottom lines of the airlines that are buying this aircraft. But the fuels is something that it's not the airlines that are responsible for developing it. It's not the aircraft manufacturers that are responsible for developing it. It's a third body, and you have to have those three groups kind of work together towards the development of the fuels. And what we've seen over the past 10 years or so is that the airlines, aircraft operators, specifically commercial aircraft operators, have wanted to become more sustainable, but haven't yet been willing or able to bear the costs of becoming more sustainable and the costs of innovating fuels in that way. So there are a lot of kind of announcements around sustainable aviation fuel these days, but most of them are relatively small amounts. And so what we need is really a game changer in terms of either policy driving the uptake of those fuels, that could be a subsidy or that could be a mandate. So I'm not deciding I'm not taking an opinion on which one is more necessary, but there's been a lot of talk recently about a blender's fuel credit, blenders fuel blender, BTC, blender's tax credit for aviation fuel. Sorry, I'm getting my acronyms confused. That's being put forward right now in Congress. That would be enormously helpful. Other governments have taken different approaches and have been trying to enforce blending mandates. So one way or the other, I think that policy driver is going to be critical to getting fuel, sustainable aviation fuel really flowing. The second piece is getting the customers involved. So I've been really lucky to help to be able to kind of partner with the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, and the Environmental Defense Fund over the past year to launch the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, SABA. And SABA is kind of an innovative new alliance with partners from Netflix, Microsoft, I'm afraid I'm going to miss some of them, Salesforce, JP Morgan Chase, other large companies, Boeing, who are involved in this effort. And basically what they came to us and said was they want a standardized way to invest in sustainable aviation fuel so that they feel comfortable that the fuels they are supporting are really sustainable, that they're the kind of tracked from feedstock all the way to use. And that the emission reductions that they are claiming towards, in particular, scope 3 targets or indirect emissions targets, are verifiable. And so they came to, EDF and RMI, and luckily I've been able to help out on that. And the end goal is, we're now developing a SAF certificate system that will enable these companies to have SAF certificates generated much like the renewable energy certificate or renewable energy credit market. And they'll be able to invest in SAF in that way. And that'll help kind of add an additional demand signal to the market that'll, hopefully help to move things beyond where they've been so far. So those are the two big pieces. And the third piece would be all of these airlines taking really ambitious targets for hitting, both through ICAO, but also individually for their own emission reduction goals. I need to see them invest in meeting those targets as well. So that's why I kind of put that third on the list. But I think that is also a driver. It's just a question of how much it is actually driving change right now.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, one of the themes that we're clearly seeing is that, these problems are too big to solve in silos. And so, what we need to really do is think about all the different incentives, all the different stakeholders, and find ways to connect and align those stakeholders around a common set of objectives and a common sense of values in order to create the kinds of reinforcing actions, Kim, that you're describing between, what's really exciting about SABA and having the buyers themselves and air travel, people who are invested hugely in air travel, be able to think about that, but also have the airlines and also have the military enter into really mutually reinforcing partnerships.